In the fog-shrouded streets of medieval London, where the Thames River carried whispers of conspiracy and rebellion, the Crown wielded its most fearsome weapon against those who dared challenge royal authority: the sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This punishment, first recorded in its full form during the reign of Henry III in 1241, emerged from a society where the concept of high treason represented the gravest of all crimes, an offence not just against the monarch, but against God's appointed order itself. The first documented victim of this specific combination was William Maurice, executed in 1241 for piracy, marking the beginning of this brutal chapter in English judicial history. The roots of high treason in medieval England trace back to the Norman Conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror established a feudal system that demanded absolute loyalty to the crown. Under this system, as documented in contemporary chronicles like those of Matthew Paris, even minor acts of defiance could be interpreted as treasonous. The case of William of Aldery in 1076 exemplifies this. He was executed merely for saying that Earl Waltheof, who had recently been beheaded for conspiracy, was wrongfully killed. The period following the Norman Conquest saw a remarkable surge in treason accusations, with the Domesday Book recording over 100 cases of lands seized from traitors to the Norman regime. In 1283, the first documented case of the full punishment was carried out on Dafydd ap Gruffydd, the last independent Prince of Wales. His execution set a precedent for how the most severe cases of treason would be handled. Contemporary chronicler Walter of Guisborough described the execution in horrifying detail, noting how Dafydd was drawn through the streets of Shrewsbury on a horse's tail, hanged alive, cut down while conscious, disemboweled, and his entrails burned before his eyes while still living. His body was then quartered, with parts sent to Winchester, York, Northampton and Bristol. His head joined that of his brother Llywelyn ap Gruffydd on London Bridge, marking the end of independent Welsh rulership. Before this standardized form of execution, traitors faced various brutal fates. Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe how traitors were sometimes buried alive or thrown into pits of serpents. The Vikings, who significantly influenced English justice, practiced the blood eagle, a ritual allegedly performed on King Aella of Northumbria in 867 by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. The Norman influence brought its own traditions, including the forest gallows, where traitors were hanged so high their bodies could be seen from great distances. In 1096, William of Yu was brutally blinded and castrated for plotting against William Rufus, demonstrating how punishment methods often combined multiple forms of torture. The legal framework for high treason was formally codified in the Treason Act of 1351, but its implementation varied dramatically. Take the case of Sir Thomas Blount in 1400, who was hanged and cut down while still alive, then forced to sit and watch his own entrails being removed and burned. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham recorded Blount's last words, "Blessed be this day," when asked what he would give for a final meal. The Act's reach extended to seemingly minor offences. In 1381, John Ball was executed for preaching that social equality was God's will during the Peasants' Revolt, his sermon famously asking, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Religious ideology played a crucial role in justifying these brutal punishments. The Church, represented by influential figures like Archbishop Stephen Langton, promoted the concept of divine right of kings, arguing that an attack on the monarch was an attack on God's chosen representative. This theological justification reached its apex during the reign of Henry VIII, when Sir Thomas More, despite his previous high position, was condemned for treason for refusing to acknowledge the king as supreme head of the church. Before his more merciful beheading, More famously declared, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." The spectacle of public execution served multiple purposes in medieval society. Records from the execution of Sir William Wallace describe how thousands gathered at Smithfield to witness his death. The English chronicler Robert of Brune provided a particularly vivid account. They led him through London with great shame on a sledge drawn by horses to the gallows of Harm. During Wallace's execution, witnesses reported that he remained defiant until the end, singing "Summa is Ecumen in," a popular English folk song, as a final act of defiance. His execution site at Smithfield would later become notorious for other famous deaths, including that of Wat Tyler, leader of the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. Public executions followed a carefully choreographed ritual. In 1330, Roger Mortimer's execution at Tyburn set new precedents for ceremonial brutality. As the Queen's former lover and alleged usurper of royal power, his death was especially elaborate. The procession to Tyburn took 3 hours, with stops at prescribed locations where heralds read out his crimes. At each stop, he was forced to wear a different crown made of nettles, symbolizing his perceived attempt to seize royal power. The famous Tyburn tree, erected in 1571, became so iconic that it inspired the popular ballad The Tyburn Jig, which mockingly described condemned prisoners dancing at the end of the rope. The role of the crowd was essential to these spectacles. During the execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger in 1326, contemporary chronicles record that women in the crowd brought their children to witness the event, believing it would grant them courage and loyalty to the crown. Despenser's execution was particularly gruesome. He was forced to wear a crown of nettles and a tabard painted with his family coat of arms reversed, marking him as a traitor. The crowd's participation became so enthusiastic that they began throwing offal and excrement at him during the procession. A French chronicler, Jean Froissart, recorded that never was seen in England so horrible an execution. The psychological impact of these executions was carefully calculated. During the 1605 execution of the Gunpowder Plot conspirators, including Guy Fawkes and Thomas Wintour, the authorities deliberately positioned the scaffold so that each conspirator could watch their confederates die before their own turn came. Sir Edward Coke, the prosecutor, famously declared during their trial, "A desperate disease requires a desperate remedy." The executioner, Edward Dennis, was paid an extra fee of £23, 6 shillings and 8 pence for handling such a high-profile execution, more than 6 months' wages for a skilled craftsman of the time. The display of body parts became an art form in itself. London Bridge served as the city's primary exhibition space for traitors' heads from the 13th to the 18th centuries. The heads were first parboiled in salt water and dipped in tar to preserve them, then impaled on pikes and displayed in prominent positions. The head of Sir Thomas More remained on display for nearly a month in 1535, until his daughter, Margaret Roper, bribed a guard to take it down. She preserved it in spices and kept it until her death. By 1598, German visitor Paul Hentzner counted over 30 heads on the bridge, noting in his travelogue that the spectacle did much to impress upon foreigners the strength of English law. When traitors shall be thus punished, let all men take heed how they devise any treason against their sovereign lord the king, proclaimed the herald at Thomas Wyatt's execution in 1554. This warning echoed across centuries of English history, as the punishment of hanging, drawing and quartering remained the ultimate expression of royal vengeance until its abolition in 1870, marking the end of an era where public justice and spectacular brutality went hand in hand. Anatomy of horror, the dark art of England's most notorious execution. On a bitter November morning in 1569, John Felton's final moments at St. Paul's Cathedral would serve as a grotesque masterclass in the executioner's craft. The condemned man's journey began hours earlier, as he was dragged on a wooden hurdle through London's muddy streets, his body bouncing against every cobblestone, a prelude to the horror that awaited. This standard practice of hurdle dragging served two purposes. It weakened the condemned and provided a spectacular parade for the gathering crowd. The execution ground, whether at Tyburn, Smithfield or Tower Hill, was carefully prepared for maximum visibility. The executioner, a figure both reviled and respected, would have tested his ropes and sharpened his array of specialized tools the night before. These included several knives of varying sizes, a cleaver and a large axe. In Felton's case, the executioner was Bull, one of London's most experienced death dealers, known for his ability to keep victims conscious through much of the ordeal, a skill considered essential for this particular form of execution. The hanging phase required exceptional precision. Unlike standard executions where a long drop would break the neck, these hangings demanded a shorter drop using a specialized gallows. Contemporary accounts from the execution of Thomas Armstrong in 1684 describe how the executioner used a system of counterweights to ensure the victim was strangled just enough to weaken them, but not kill them. The rope was typically soaked in vinegar beforehand to prevent stretching, allowing better control over the process. Records show that victims were usually suspended for 3-4 minutes before being cut down, though some executioners, like Richard Brandon, were known to use their own judgment based on the victim's constitution. The drawing phase began while the victim was still conscious, a crucial element of the punishment. Using a specially designed knife with a curved blade, the executioner would make a precise incision from sternum to pelvis. Contemporary medical knowledge, often passed down through generations of executioners, guided this process. During the execution of Francis Derham in 1541, witnesses recorded how the executioner carefully avoided major blood vessels to prevent the victim from bleeding out too quickly. The entrails were literally drawn out while the victim watched, often accompanied by a running commentary from the executioner or herald about the justice being served. Richard Brandon's personal diary, discovered after his death in 1649, revealed that he used a specific set of 6 knives, each dedicated to a different part of the evisceration process. The first cut, made with what he called the mercy blade, was designed to be shallow enough to prevent immediate death, but deep enough to access the abdominal cavity. This technique was demonstrated with particular skill during the execution of Thomas Harrison in 1660, where witnesses reported he remained conscious for nearly 30 minutes after the initial incision. Sir Thomas More's secretary, writing in 1535, described how executioner William Cayleys used mirrors positioned to ensure that Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, could witness her own disembowelment during her execution in 1541. The mirrors, he noted, were arranged at precise angles, 3 in number, polished daily by the executioner's apprentice. This grotesque practice became standard for high-profile executions, with records showing that the Tower of London maintained a permanent set of execution mirrors stored alongside other implements of death. The disembowelment process followed a specific ritual. First, the small intestines were removed, followed by larger organs. Each organ was shown to the crowd before being cast into a cauldron of boiling water, positioned within the victim's line of sight. During Robert François Damiens' execution in 1757, it took the executioner nearly an hour to complete this phase, with witnesses noting how the condemned remained conscious through much of it. The quartering phase required immense physical strength and precision. The executioner would first remove the limbs at their major joints, using a combination of knife work and brute force. The body was then split through the torso, creating 4 distinct quarters. Tools used included heavy cleavers and specialized saws, with different executioners favoring different methods. During the execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger in 1326, chronicles record that the quartering took nearly an hour, with each cut precisely planned to maintain symmetrical pieces for display. The role of executioner was hereditary in many cases, passed down through families who guarded their techniques closely. The Brandon family dominated London's execution scene from 1538 to 1649, with Gregory Brandon and his son Richard becoming particularly notorious. Richard Brandon reportedly earned £33 per execution, equivalent to several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Executioners developed their own specialized techniques. For instance, John Ketch was known for using a particular sawing motion that supposedly prolonged consciousness. The psychological preparation was equally methodical. Father John Gerard's secret diary from 1606 describes how condemned prisoners in the Tower of London were deliberately housed in cells where they could hear the sharpening of knives and the testing of ropes. Before Robert Catesby's planned execution, though he died before reaching the scaffold, the guards would purposely discuss execution details within his earshot. The night watchman's logs from January 1606 record how Guy Fawkes was kept awake by the sound of hammering as his scaffold was constructed, a practice described as the Vigil of Terror. During the reign of Henry VIII, Master Executioner Thomas Mountford introduced several innovations to the quartering process. His technique, documented in Tower records from 1532, involved specific cutting angles that prevented immediate death while maximizing the display value of the quartered remains. During Edward Stafford's execution in 1521, Mountford demonstrated such precision that, according to witnesses, each quarter was of equal weight, as measured by the scaffold's scales. This attention to detail earned him an additional payment of 10 shillings, recorded in the Tower's expense accounts. The treatment of organs followed strict protocols based on both practical and symbolic considerations. During the execution of the Babington plotters in 1586, Executioner John Davis followed a specific order: heart, liver, lungs, and lesser organs. Each organ had its designated cauldron, positioned at different heights on the scaffold. The Tower's inventory from 1597 lists 4 copper cauldrons of graduating sizes for the separate boiling of noble and common organs. This distinction reflected the belief that different organs housed different aspects of the condemned's treasonous nature. The distribution of body parts followed increasingly complex protocols. After the execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger in 1326, his quarters were sent to 4 specific cities, each chosen for its symbolic significance: York, representing the north; Bristol, his power base; Dover, facing France, where he had allies; and Newcastle, marking the kingdom's northern limit. The Tower's dispatch records show that each quarter was transported in a specially made cedar box, packed with salt and herbs, accompanied by an armed guard and a written proclamation to be read at its destination. The heads were typically reserved for London Bridge, where they underwent a preservation process involving parboiling in salt water and tar coating, allowing them to remain recognizable for months. Court records from 1578 show that Christopher Walpole was paid 2 shillings per head for this preservation work. The implements of execution themselves carried deep symbolic meaning. The ropes were often specially woven, with some executioners insisting on 13 strands to represent Christ and the Apostles. During the execution of the Babington plotters, 7 different knives were used, each blessed or cursed, depending on perspective, by a priest beforehand. The executioner's axe for quartering was typically weighted at 7 pounds, a weight determined through generations of practice to provide the optimal balance of force and control. Physical suffering reached heights that modern medical understanding can barely comprehend. Dr. James Beaton, a physician present at several 17th century executions, wrote in his private journals about victims' hearts continuing to beat for up to 4 minutes after being removed from the body. During the execution of Edward Marcus Despard in 1803, observers noted that his eyes remained open and responsive even after disembowelment had begun. The executioner, Thomas Derrick, from whose name the term derrick for a hanging apparatus originates, developed a technique in the 1600s that would keep victims conscious through approximately 40% of the quartering process. Master executioners developed distinct specialties and techniques. Jack Ketch, notorious for his botched beheadings, was paradoxically considered one of the most skilled at prolonging life during drawing and quartering. His technique involved making shallow cuts initially, allowing him to extend the victim's consciousness through most of the evisceration. Richard Brandon, known as the King's Executioner, developed a unique method of partial hanging that became standard practice, involving precise rope placement and timing that he recorded in a private journal discovered after his death in 1649. The entrails themselves were handled according to strict protocol. During the execution of Henry Garnet in 1606, witnesses described how the executioner separated different organs into distinct piles, each with its own symbolic meaning. The heart, considered the seat of treasonous thoughts, was always burned first. The liver, believed to house courage, was often the last organ removed while the victim was conscious. Some executioners, like Edward Dennis, were known to narrate this process to the crowd, explaining the significance of each organ as it was removed. "I feel my heart, God receive my soul." These famous last words of Robert Keyes, executed in 1606 for his role in the gunpowder plot, exemplify the horrifying consciousness victims maintained during their ordeal. The executioner Bull, who performed this particular execution, was praised in contemporary accounts for maintaining Keyes's awareness until the moment his heart was physically removed from his body, a feat that earned him an extra payment of 5 shillings from the watching nobility. A particularly macabre detail comes from the execution of Sir Thomas Armstrong in 1684, where the executioner, following a specific request from King Charles II, ensured that Armstrong's face was turned toward Whitehall Palace during the disembowelment, so that his treasonous eyes might behold the seat of power he had offended. The execution took 2 hours and 23 minutes from start to finish, with Armstrong reportedly remaining conscious for over an hour of the procedure. From Wallace to Monmouth, tales of torture and treachery. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned with an unusual bustle in London's Smithfield district. William Wallace, the Scottish warrior who had defied English rule for years, was about to face what contemporary chronicler Matthew of Westminster would describe as the most elaborate execution ever devised on English soil. Wallace's capture near Glasgow by Sir John Menteith, who received 40 marks of silver for his betrayal, had ended a 7-year campaign that had seen him rise from obscurity to become Guardian of Scotland. His capture location, now marked by a plaque at Rob Royston, became a pilgrimage site for Scottish nationalists. The night before his execution, Wallace was held in a notorious cell in the Tower of London, known as the Scottish Chamber, where guards reported he spent his final hours carving Celtic crosses into the stone walls with his fingernails. Wallace's death would set the template for centuries of state-sanctioned spectacle. According to the Lanercost Chronicle, Wallace was dragged through London's streets behind 4 horses, rather than the usual one, so that all might witness the price of defiance. His transportation device, known as a hurdle, was specially constructed of green oak to withstand the weight and struggle. The route, meticulously documented in the Sheriff of London's records, covered nearly 4 miles, beginning at the Tower of London's Western Gate, proceeding through Aldgate, Cheapside, past St. Paul's Cathedral, and finally to Smithfield. Local records indicate that shopkeepers were ordered to close their businesses and attend the procession, with fines of 2 shillings levied on those who refused. Death comes to all, but great achievements raise a monument which shall endure until the sun grows cold. These words, attributed to Wallace himself, were recorded by monk Thomas of Pluscarden, who witnessed the execution while disguised as a merchant. Contemporary accounts, particularly those from the Scottish Chronicles, describe Wallace's final moments with haunting detail. The execution lasted nearly 4 hours, with the executioner, Thomas of Liverpool, whose family had served as executioners for 3 generations, following a specific sequence designed to maximize both suffering and symbolic meaning. The executioner's payment records show he received 20 shillings, 4 times the usual fee, for his exceptional service to the Crown. The case of Guy Fawkes brings us to November 5, 1605, when the gunpowder plot was discovered. Fawkes's interrogation in the Queen's House at the Tower of London lasted for 8 days, during which he endured increasingly severe torture on the rack. His signature on his confession, preserved in the National Archives, shows the dramatic deterioration of his handwriting from the first day to the last. Before his execution on January 31, 1606, Fawkes shared his cell with 2 other conspirators, Thomas Wintour and Ambrose Rookwood, in what guards called the Powdermen's Chamber. Contemporary records from the Tower's Catholic chaplain, Father William Cornwell, indicate that Fawkes maintained his composure until the end, even jesting with his guards about the quality of the gunpowder they had confiscated. Fawkes and his fellow plotters were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. However, in a final act of defiance that became legendary, Fawkes managed to cheat the executioner of the full, horrific spectacle. When led to the gallows at Old Palace Yard, Westminster, he jumped from the ladder leading to the noose, breaking his neck and dying instantly. His body was nevertheless quartered, and the parts were sent to the four corners of the kingdom as a warning. Edmund Campion's execution in 1581 marked a turning point in religious persecutions. The Tower's expense accounts reveal that special galleries were constructed at Tyburn to accommodate the unprecedented crowd of 20,000 spectators, including several foreign ambassadors. Campion, a former Oxford scholar, delivered what became known as his scaffold sermon, speaking for nearly an hour before the authorities silenced him. His executioner, John Bull, later converted to Catholicism, claiming he was moved by Campion's forgiveness. As recorded in the diary of Richard Topcliffe, the notorious priest-hunter, Campion's clothes were torn into pieces by the crowd and preserved as relics, some of which survive today in Catholic museums across Europe. The 1571 execution of John Story became legendary for its political implications. Story's position as a former Member of Parliament made his death particularly significant. The Spanish ambassador, Don Guerrero de Spes, wrote detailed accounts of the execution in his dispatches to Philip II, describing how Story maintained his dignity despite extreme suffering. The rope used in his hanging was specially imported from Italy, believed to be stronger than English hemp. According to Tower records, Story's heart continued beating for 7 minutes after removal, leading to widespread rumors of divine intervention. His final words, "Blessed be the holy name of God," were recorded by 3 different chroniclers, lending credibility to their authenticity. Hugh Despenser the Younger's execution in 1326 became a benchmark for theatrical cruelty. Contemporary records from Hereford Cathedral detail how the scaffold was constructed using timber from 3 separate counties, symbolizing the breadth of his alleged crimes. The execution site, chosen for its elevation at what is now called Despenser's Mount, offered visibility to an estimated crowd of 30,000. French chronicler Jean Lebel recorded that Queen Isabella ordered special seating constructed for herself and the young Edward III, though the latter was reportedly physically ill during the spectacle. Despenser's execution introduced several innovations in torture, including the use of a specially designed rack that could be adjusted in full view of the crowd. The Herald's execution poem, preserved in the Bodleian Library, contains 108 verses in both Norman French and English, each describing a separate crime. When tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. This quote, attributed to Edward Plantagenet, 17th Earl of Warwick, resonated through his execution in 1499. The Tower's prisoner log reveals that Warwick spent 14 years in a cell, measuring merely 8 feet by 6 feet, with only a small window facing the Thames. His execution warrant, signed by Henry VII himself, specified that the event should occur at sunrise, when the light first touches the Tower walls. Master executioner John Chambers received detailed instructions to ensure Warwick remained conscious throughout the ordeal, using a mixture of vinegar and rosewater to revive him when necessary. The execution's cost, recorded in the Royal Treasury accounts, amounted to £67, 14 shillings and 9 pence, equivalent to a knight's annual salary. John Ballard's 1586 execution as part of the Babington Plot showcased the evolution of execution techniques. The Tower's Master of Ceremonies, Sir Owen Hopton, introduced a new 3-tiered scaffold design that allowed different aspects of the execution to be visible from various angles. Ballard's prophecy about Catholic martyrs was recorded in 6 different contemporary sources, including the secret diary of Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel. The preservation of his head involved an innovative technique developed by royal physician Christopher Walpole, using a mixture of saltpeter, alum, and mercury compounds. The expense accounts show that maintaining the head on London Bridge cost the Crown 3 shillings per week for 3 months. The Duke of Monmouth's botched execution in 1685 led to significant reforms in executioner selection. Jack Ketch's infamous performance was detailed in multiple sources, including Samuel Pepys's diary and the official Tower execution records. The axe used, which required 5 strokes to complete the beheading, is still preserved in the Tower of London's artifacts collection. Ketch's fine of 2 weeks' wages amounted to 25 shillings, though he was required to pay an additional 10 shillings for damage to the execution block. Monmouth's last words, "There are those above who know I die innocent," were recorded by both the official clerk and 3 independent witnesses. The last dance with death, the rise and fall of England's most dreaded punishment. The transformation of public sentiment regarding judicial execution in England underwent a remarkable evolution between the 16th and 19th centuries. In 1571, crowds numbering over 50,000 gathered at Tyburn to witness the execution of Catholic martyr John Story, with contemporary accounts describing the atmosphere as festive, with vendors selling meat pies and ale. By 1783, when the last public execution was held at Tyburn, before moving to Newgate Prison, the crowd's mood had shifted dramatically. Diarist James Boswell recorded the persistent murmurs of discontent and noted how several ladies of quality fainted at the spectacle. The turning point in public perception can be traced to several high-profile cases in the mid-18th century. The 1757 execution of Robert François Damiens in France for attempted regicide, which involved similar methods to the English punishment, generated widespread horror across Europe. Voltaire's detailed account in Candide sparked intellectual debate about the nature of justice and cruelty. In England, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham wrote, "The punishment of drawing and quartering is a triumph of terror over reason and of barbarism over justice." Cesare Beccaria's influential work, On Crimes and Punishments, had a profound impact on English legal thought. The book, which argued that the certainty of punishment was more effective than its severity, was translated into English and circulated among Parliament members. Lord Chief Justice William Murray, Earl of Mansfield, cited Beccaria's principles in his 1770 ruling that restricted the application of drawing and quartering to only the most extreme cases of high treason. In 1772, a significant shift occurred when Judge William Blackstone published his Commentaries on the Laws of England, questioning the effectiveness of extreme punishments. He noted that of 167 executions performed at Tyburn between 1749 and 1771, only 3 involved the full drawing and quartering procedure, suggesting a growing reluctance among judges to impose the maximum sentence. The practice stood in stark contrast to other European methods of execution. While the breaking wheel remained common in France until 1789, and burning at the stake continued in Spain until 1834, England's legal system began showing signs of reform earlier. The Bloody Code, which had prescribed death for over 200 offences, began to be dismantled. Sir Samuel Romilly, speaking in Parliament in 1810, argued that a nation's laws should reflect its progression toward civilization, not its barbaric past. Statistical records from Newgate Prison show a marked decline in drawing and quartering sentences, from an average of 4 per year in the 1700s to only 1 between 1800 and 1820. The last full application of the sentence occurred in 1782 with David Tyree, convicted of high treason for spying for France. Witnesses reported that the crowd of 20,000 watched in silence, a stark contrast to the raucous atmospheres of earlier centuries. The philosophical debate intensified through the works of prison reformer Elizabeth Fry, who began visiting Newgate in 1813. Her detailed accounts of prisoners' conditions, published in Observations on the Visiting, Superintendence, and Government of Female Prisoners, helped shift public opinion toward more humane treatment of criminals. The Morning Chronicle newspaper published a series of articles titled On the Barbarity of English Law, which specifically targeted drawing and quartering as a relic of darker ages. The punishment's reputation for excessive cruelty was further highlighted when compared to methods used elsewhere. while guillotine executions in France were quick and considered relatively humane, and Prussia had adopted hanging as its primary method, by 1851, England's maintenance of drawing and quartering was increasingly seen as anachronistic. The Times editorial noted, "We maintain this savage ceremony while our continental neighbours have progressed to more civilized methods of dispatch." The 1830s marked a decisive shift in both legal reform and public sentiment. The Reform Act of 1832 brought new, more progressive voices into Parliament, including Thomas Babington Macaulay, who delivered a powerful speech in 1833 comparing English execution methods to the tortures of savage tribes. His words, recorded in Hansard, sparked a series of parliamentary debates that would continue for 3 decades. "When we maintain such practices," he argued, "we place ourselves below the moral standing of nations we claim to civilize." The case of William Cundell and John Smith in 1830 proved particularly influential. Though sentenced to be drawn and quartered for coining offences, their punishment was commuted to simple hanging after intense public pressure. The petition for clemency, preserved in the Home Office records, bears over 10,000 signatures, including those of prominent physicians who argued that prolonged suffering served no judicial purpose. Dr. James K. Shuttleworth's medical testimony before a parliamentary committee detailed the physiological effects of drawing and quartering, leading the Lancet to publish an editorial condemning the practice as medical barbarism. By the 1840s, the contrast between England's execution methods and those of other nations became increasingly embarrassing to the political establishment. While Belgium had abolished capital punishment for political crimes in 1831 and Portugal had ended all executions by 1867, England maintained its theoretical right to impose drawing and quartering. The disparity was noted by foreign observers. French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in 1845 that England's retention of medieval punishments stands in curious contrast to her industrial and social progress. Charles Dickens, who witnessed several executions as a journalist, became a powerful voice for reform. His 1849 letters to the Daily News described public executions as barbarous spectacles that degraded society. He specifically mentioned the drawing and quartering provision, calling it a shameful memorial to an age we should have outgrown. His influence helped mobilize middle-class opposition to extreme punishments, with the Association for the Abolition of Capital Punishment recording a membership increase from 200 in 1846 to over 3,000 by 1855. The turning point came with the case of William Orsini in 1858. Though convicted of attempting to assassinate Napoleon III of France, the prospect of applying the full sentence of drawing and quartering to a political prisoner caused international outcry. The American ambassador called it inconsistent with the age of telegraphs and steam engines. The sentence was commuted, but the debate it sparked led to the Punishment of High Treason Act 1858, which effectively ended the practice of disemboweling and quartering, though it remained technically legal. Statistical analysis of the Tower records shows the dramatic decline in sentences. Between 1820 and 1850, only 12 people were sentenced to be drawn and quartered, with none of these sentences being carried out in full. The cost of maintaining the execution apparatus, recorded in Treasury documents, amounted to £127 annually by 1860, despite its disuse. This financial argument, combined with moral objections, contributed to the push for formal abolition. The legal profession increasingly distanced itself from extreme punishments. The Law Times Journal published a series of articles between 1860 and 1868, arguing for comprehensive reform of capital punishment. Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, in his History of the Criminal Law of England, devoted an entire chapter to criticising drawing and quartering as a punishment more barbarous than any now practised among the recognised nations of the earth. The final phase of abolition was marked by the Treason Felony Act 1848 and the Forfeiture Act 1870, which officially removed drawing and quartering from English law. Lord Chief Justice Cockburn, speaking in support of the 1870 Act, remarked that, "We close the book on a chapter of legal history that has brought more shame than justice to our nation." The reforms coincided with broader changes in criminal justice, including the end of public executions in 1868 and the standardization of hanging protocols under William Marwood, the first scientific hangman. Public reaction to the abolition was recorded in various newspapers of the time. The Manchester Guardian wrote on July 14, 1870, "At last we may claim to have entered the modern age of justice, where punishment seeks reformation rather than revenge." The last person who could have theoretically faced the punishment was Michael Barrett, executed in 1868 for the Clerkenwell bombing, but he received only hanging, marking the quiet end of England's most notorious form of execution. Such horrors now lie behind us, relics of an era when public executions were seen as both entertainment and a warning. But these stories, dripping with blood and laced with sorrow, endure as a stark reminder of humanity's darker chapters. Picture William Wallace's haunting last words before facing this fate in 1305. "Freedom in life and death are worth the pain of this hour." His dismembered body parts were displayed across Scotland as a warning, yet they became symbols of resistance instead of submission. And so, as we close the pages of this harrowing history, let us reflect on what it teaches us about power, punishment, and the price of dissent. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, take care.